and welcome to a special interview for VIT today. We have with us an extremely special guest, Dr. Ram Madhav. He is an Indian politician and he serves as the National General Secretary of the Bharatiya Janata Party. Bharatiya Janata Party is the ruling party in India. And he's also a very well-known author. His latest book was one of a bestseller in our country. So we want to start this conversation on a high note for the BJP and perhaps for the country as well. The construction of the Ram Mandir has finally begun. The Bhumi Pujan happened early in August. The Prime Minister and senior ministers of the party, including the Chief Minister and Governor, attended the puja. How does it feel given that you've been a part of this movement from such a long time, from the very beginning of this movement in the 90s? How does it feel as a leader to have achieved this after decades?
Thank you for that very important question. Ram Janmabhoomi movement was essentially a movement of 1.3 billion Indians. Ram symbolized the ethos of India. So every Indian, in fact, I would go to the extent of saying that irrespective of even their religion, respects Ram. Some worship him as a godhead, but for many others who probably may not worship him as a god, as a godhead, even for them, he symbolizes an epitome of very holy Indian values. So in that sense, a temple coming up at the birthplace of Bhagavan Ram is definitely a matter of great happiness, great delight for crores and crores, millions and millions of Indians. Whether that makes me happy or for that matter, people like me happy, obviously yes, it makes us happy. But we would have been happier had we reached that stage of building, commencement of the construction of the temple through a consensus route. Had we been able to build a larger consensus, especially between the two parties, on one side was the Ram Janmabhoomi Nyas, and on the other side was the essentially Muslim bodies led by Muslim Personal Law Board, MPLAB. Had there been an agreement between these two, and through a consensus, we were able to convince the construction of this temple, we would have been much more happier. That would have symbolized greater unity, which Bhagavan Ram has always represented for us. When we launched the movement, or rather when we got associated with that movement in early 80s, the idea was that Ram was one symbol which would unite the entire country. So Ram as a unifying symbol, Ram temple as an unifying edifice for this country, for its people, for its civilization, is what we intended when we launched that movement or participated in this movement. So having said it, yes, we are all very happy, very delighted that finally the movement has come, the construction of the temple now ultimately began.
Right. So lots of people have different takes on this issue. Some believe that this was a mere property dispute, but others claim that India's history had been whitewashed and is now being reclaimed, and thus it's a sacred moment for the Hindus. What's your take on this, and how do you explain this as a victory for India?
It is definitely should not be definitely dismissed as a property dispute alone, although there is an element of property issue involved in it. But that was only for the courts with respect to the ownership of that property. Finally, the ownership of Bhagavan Ram himself, Ram Lalla himself, has been upheld and vindicated by the Supreme Court. But it is not just about a small piece of land, a property. India, we all know, has innumerable number of temples, a large number of them dedicated to Bhagavan Ram himself. Not a single town or village you will come across where there is not a temple dedicated to Bhagavan Ram. Yet, Ayodhya symbolizes a totally different and a very, very fundamentally profound idea of India's civilization and culture. Ayodhya, of course, for Hindus is a very sacred place because it is considered to be the birthplace of Bhagavan Ram. But do you know that Ayodhya is also equally sacred for the Jains? At least 5 of their main Tirthankars were born there in Ayodhya. It's a sacred place for Buddhists because Bhagavan Buddha himself spent time in Ayodhya. In fact, it is believed that one of his teeth fell there. It's a sacred place for Buddhists. It's a very important place for the Sikhs in the Sikh tradition. In fact, Sikh armies had participated in the battle to reclaim Ram Janmabhoomi from the Mughal invaders in the 17th century. I'm talking about the history of 17th century. And from Guru Nanak Dev to Guru Gobind Singh, many of the gurus had paid a visit to that sacred place. So that way, Ayodhya also symbolizes the greater civilizational unity of our country. In that sense, Ayodhya is much more important than merely a place of another Ram temple. The history part is definitely important because, after all, India is not just a nation of some 200 or 300 or 400 years like many Western nations. If you see the histories of many European nations or even countries like America, their histories do not date back beyond a couple of centuries. Whereas the history or the life of India, its civilization, is millennia old. So when you talk about a country with a history which is more than 5 millennia, 6 millennia, then the whole conception about places like Ayodhya becomes totally different. They represent this civilizational ancientness, the civilizational greatness, civilizational vastness of this country. So a temple at the birthplace of Bhagwan Ram, or a temple or in a city called Ayodhya where Bhagavan Buddha had tread at one time, from where many of the Tirthankars of Jain tradition came, a place which is very sacred for many Sikh gurus, obviously is a very important, significant place for the civilizational India of 5,000 plus years. So Ayodhya's importance has to be understood from that civilizational background, not merely from some historical battles that have happened, or not definitely from the prism of a property dispute.
Right, sir. When Mr. Advani, the then leader of the movement that began in the 80s and 90s, at the end of the movement, you could rather say that the movement ended at a disruptive note. Even you said that you would have preferred it ended at a consensus where both the sides agreed to something on a lighter note instead of getting disruptive about what happened. Multiple leaders, probably a decade or after the disruption with which the movement ended, came back and said that they would have preferred a lighter or a more vocational, or would have preferred having conversed about the issue and rather than getting disruptive about it. Where do you stand on this disruption and the violence that took place on the issue of the issue that was because of the violence that was caused because of the issue in the 90s and even now subtly at times?
The leaders of the Ram Janmabhoomi movement have never sponsored, nor supported, nor condoned any violence. So first take it from me that we were all very much integral to that movement. We never ever supported violence in any form. As I said, it would have been an excellent scenario had we come to a kind of a mutually agreed upon solution to it, or a consensus over allowing the temple to come up there. Many such wonderful opportunities came the way of the communities. A very sincere effort was made in the final stages before that unfortunate demolition which had taken place in 1992. A very last minute effort was made by Prime Minister Chandrasekhar. Although his government lived for a very short time, even in that short period, he tried to find a solution through discussions between the two communities. But unfortunately, here I would like to take up the name of the party which took an uncalled for stridency. That is the Muslim Personal Law Board side. There, the whole issue, a wonderful opportunity, slipped out of our hands. So we all must remember that Ayodhya is respected, was respected in the past, and even to this day is respected by people cutting across religions, even Muslims, even people of many other religions. They may not worship Ram as a godhead, but they still have great respect for him as an ideal leader, ideal king, ideal Raja, Adarsh Raja. Even in the past, people like Kabir, or much later, even people like Muhammad Iqbal, they all had great praise for Ram. They identified this land, its culture, and its civilization with Ram. They never had any dispute with Ram as an important civilizational figure of Indian civilization and culture. But unfortunately, the opportunity was let go by the Muslim Personal Law Board because of its intransigent position on the issue. That is when certain unexpected kind of developments, which were of course never supported or never appreciated by the leaders of the community, happened. We could have avoided all that. Here, beginning from now, we must avoid any such thing happening between the communities, especially if you look at what happened when the judgment came, the way the leaders of the Ram Janma Bhoomi movement behaved. If you look at that, there was no, jingoism, no, this kind of celebrations of victory and all that. Instead, the leadership gave a call to the countrymen that don't look at this judgment which came in favor of the Ram temple as a victory to one community or a defeat to another community. Don't look at it from that prism. Please look at it as a great victory to our ancient civilization and ancient culture. That approach of the movement's leadership has certainly helped in the last more than 1 year, ever since the judgment came, for us to move on without any difficulty. I hope that the spirit of bonhomie, spirit of friendship among the communities between the important two religions in this country will not be hampered by any development connected with the Ram temple, because Ram symbolizes unity. Ram does not symbolize any dispute or disruption.
So before I jump into a different topic, something I wanted to understand that's very fundamental about politics, especially as a young adult, is the relevance of history and identity as a part of politics today. And this is not something that's limited to our country, but even globally, in say Brazil, Germany, across the Middle East, is the growing importance of identity and history as a part of politics. So what do you think creates a significance, and why is that a huge part of politics today?
Nationalism is the flavor of the day in the world today. But you must remember that nationalism means different things to different countries. Countries that had just a history of 2 centuries For them, their political identity becomes their national identity. But whereas countries like India, which have an existence of millennia, when there was no one single political ruler who was ruling over the entire country, yet we existed as one country, as one people, as one nation. You are in Tamil Nadu. The temple of Rameshwaram, you go to temple of Rameshwaram, stand outside the temple for 2 hours. Let me tell you, you will see mini Hindustan there. You will see people coming from all over the country. And you come to Vaishnav Devi in Jammu, stand outside the temple for 1 hour there, you will see a mini India there. So here, the nationhood has evolved out of its civilization, out of its culture. So when we talk about this identity kind of thing in different countries, how national identities are now have become the defining feature of many different countries, we should not equate all of them, or we should not put all of them on the same pedestal. For countries with great long tradition and civilization like India, here national identities are not mere racial identities like many countries in Europe or in the West, are political identities like those countries mostly in Europe and even in Africa. So here it is a civilizational identity. It's a cultural identity that keeps this country together. I passingly mentioned, India has never had a single ruler ruling over its entire geography. You look at the entire history. India was always ruled by multiplicity of kings. Even on the day of India's independence, India had a minimum of about 560 different kingdoms. All of them were brought under one constitution. We created a constitutional entity called India. But does it mean before 1947, before 1950, when Constitution of India came, there was no India? There was still one India. There was one still idea of India. That idea was cultural, civilizational. That is as much relevant today for a constitutional India as it was relevant some 70, 75 years ago. So this identity of a cultural, civilizational nation is very, very important for us, for a country like India. Otherwise, a country with so much diversity cannot remain one. It could not have remained one for 5 millennia had it not been for that great unifying factor called our culture and our civilization.
Right, sir. The way you described the usage of this important history is a little bit different. If I were to take an example from the context in UK, United Kingdom and the United States of America, based on these very principles, decisions have been taken in governance, which is where the problem arises. For example, say the Brexit. Later on, when you study the data, you realize that a lot of it was just taken not on the knowledge of how the important the immigrants are to the Brexit or the European Union countries are to Brexit, but to the fact that nationalism was a factor to them, that they wanted to be an independent country because of the history they had, and they felt that there was a benefit from the European Union. A similar context arises in the United States, where there's an issue with migrants. Migrants are being oppressed the last 3-4 years because in the Trump administration, based solely on nationalism and a political narrative. So the way you describe it, it seems seems very nice. But countries outside are taking this principle and misconstruing it and taking decisions based on it. So how would you comment when such a principle is violated and observed from a different lens outside the country? Of course, I'm talking about these case studies specifically.
Today, you see, for various reasons, countries are turning inwards for various reasons. One major factor that has precipitated this process is this pandemic. The corona pandemic has basically precipitated and hastened this process of countries turning inwards. Look, you talked about Brexit. We all must remember that the formation of European Union some 50 years ago was purely based on certain economic interests only. Otherwise, there was no common factor defining these countries or defining the creation of an entity called European Union or European Commission. They got together because they found in it some kind of economic interests of each of those countries being served. It was seen as emerging as a strategic force. So merely purely on material considerations, they tried to create something called a European Union. Now, when they created it, they could not completely give up their national identities. Even to this day, do you think that a German or a French or an Italian would give up his national identity for the sake of a larger European Union identity? No. For him, European Union is only useful to the extent that it serves the purpose or it helps their respective countries grow bigger, grow prosperous. It is here that the question of the issues like migrants become very, very important. Although European Union is conceived as one political economic entity, there is no acceptance of free migration. I totally support the idea that unbridled migrations cannot be allowed. Countries have to regulate migratory processes. It is required, whether it is for European Union countries or countries like India. Every country has to regulate the inflow and outflow of people. Countries cannot be dharmashalas, charity homes, that anybody can come and anybody can go away. But I'm just trying to emphasize on the point that you cannot create nations on artificial grounds and then insist that since we are all one European Union, comers come, goers go, nobody to stop and nobody to allow. That cannot work, that will not work. That is the experience in countries like many countries in European Union. In fact, that is what also explains why a country like UK today decided on Brexit. Because European Union could not create that sentiment, that feeling of unity, one unit among all the different nations. That's the reason why you see a Brexit happening today.
Yes, sir. Now, you're also associated with a lot of various policy think tanks and have given your views on education and technology before. So what is your take on the policy introduced by the MHRD Ministry about the NEP and the response from the student community thus far, and specifically focusing on the importance of, say, English as well, universally, because something that the policy does recommend is that the mother tongue use till the 6th or 8th grade. But right now we are seeing that the English language is becoming more and more universal. So what is your take on that as well?
Firstly, we brought this new education policy, National Education Policy 2020, for a very important reason you must remember. The last time that we have had any such major policy statement about our education was some 4.5 decades ago. How much has the world changed? The education that I had in my childhood, if I look at it today, I consider it to be utterly irrelevant in 2020. I don't want the youngsters of today, children of today, to simply accept the same education that I had some 30, 40 years ago. Education must be upgraded from time to time. But since we have not done it for more than 4 decades, a need was felt by many eminent academics and scholars and experts in the country that it is time that we should not leave it with minor tinkerings again. We could have done some tinkerings here and there to the old policy. But it was believed that no, it's not time for mere tinkerings. It is time we came up with a totally transformed policy to suit to the 21st century youth of this country. India has, if you take 29 years as the limit which is the now definition for youth in India, is 29 years of age. 40% of our population is below 29 years. And if you take the old benchmark of 35 years, 66% of India is youthful today. This youth needs to be educated to suit the 21st century needs. That is what this new education policy is attempting to do. In that, you may naturally ask that very important question, which you have also partially asked, that you are talking about 21st century when we are living in a global village, we are all integrated globally, then how can you want country to go back to mother tongue? Mother tongue at the primary education level has been scientifically proven to be very crucial in actually unfolding the faculties, mental faculties of a child. If the primary education is given in the mother tongue, mother language, then he will be able to open up his faculties well, mental faculties well. Once he reaches a stage where he is capable of absorbing knowledge from outside, he will be better equipped to absorb knowledge from outside. Once he or she has got that basic grounding in mother tongue, that is scientifically proven. That's why if you go to France, Germany, and Italy, in all those countries, primary education is in their mother tongue. Now, it is true that we have a peculiar situation in India. If I say mother tongue, in India, there are 18 officially recognized mother tongues. How do we handle it? That is why in India, education has always been a concurrent subject. In our constitution, states have the final say. I will only just leave it with one observation, that the policy has been announced by the government. Now, Parliament is meeting on the 14th of this month. The meeting will go on until maybe 3-4 weeks. The policy will be taken up for wider discussion within the Parliament. Maybe there could be some changes here and there. But broadly, this policy is intended to cater to 21st century needs of our country, to create educated young India that can confidently face the 21st century world.
Fair enough. We can perhaps get into a longer debate on education in India. Since we just have 5-10 minutes left, I'll ask you one last question in conclusion regarding what we have in store for the future. So, how would you describe the change in Indian political dynamic in the last decade? Although the BJP was in power earlier this century, the kind of majority you got from 2014 and 2019 was unprecedented. How is the BJP planning to capitalize on the fact that you have majority in the parliament in order to follow the principle of governance, which is what the Prime Minister also stated in his speeches, widely saying that he wants to govern, he wants more governance than politics. And how do you see this capitalized as a potential to grow after we come out of this pandemic, when our economy is already at a dire state?
Before I answer this last question, let me just add one more thing to the education policy debate happening today. There seems to be some kind of reservation or criticism over the language formula incorporated in this policy. There is a 3-language formula. States have the freedom to choose their 3 languages. 2 of them have to be Indian languages. Best English education is also essential. We recognize the importance that English plays today in the larger world. So right from grade 1, or nowadays in the new education policy, education is compulsory from the age of 3 years. From 3-year-old to 18-year-old, everybody should be exposed to good education. From that stage onwards, one can be taught good English as one subject. Although the medium of instruction remains mother tongue, good English, in good standard English can be taught to our children. So this whole issue about what will happen if we teach in mother tongue can be easily addressed. Like, people like me, we have studied in local language schools. We have never Indian schools. Yet we are able to pick up that language through practice and of course through basic grounding that we had at the school level. Now coming to this vision for India, basically that's what probably you are asking in your last question. 21st century India must realize that it has enormous potential to rise in the world as a strong nation, strong country, not just a, as a student, I used to hear this whole description about India as an underdeveloped country. After some time, we started being called as a developing country. We were very happy when we were no longer described as an underdeveloped country, but a developing country. But I tell you, I have been hearing this discussion about India as a developing country for the last 40 years. When do you become a developed country? 21st century offers that great opportunity to India. So we today came to power riding over that ambition of the people. Why the people rejected previous governments? Because they wanted a new India to be built. An India that is self-confident of its inner strength, its capacity, its confidence, and that inner confidence which guides takes it to its destiny as one of the strongest nations in the world. So when we today embark on the mission of nation building, thanks to the support that we got from the people, for example, as you rightly mentioned, we got an excellent mandate in 2014, but look at the mandate in 2019. It was even bigger than the mandate that we got in 2014. So we see the mandate to us as a mandate for building a new, strong and vibrant India. And the mandate that we got was to build an India that is based on its own value system, its own Atma Shakti. Atal Bihari Vajpayee used this phrase, Atma Shakti, inner strength. The inner strength comes from its civilization, its values, its capacity, its understanding of itself and of the world. Based on that, we want to build a strong India. Remember today, if Prime Minister Narendra Modi is talking about Atmanirbhar Bharat, this is precisely what we are talking about. Atmanirbharta doesn't mean you will now stop imports and close Indian economy and you will turn inward, take back to bullock cartage. No. Atmanirbharta is about building a self-confident, self-reliant India so that we become a contributor to the world economy, not just a recipient and beneficiary of the world economy. So India has to develop its inner strength. That is Atmanirbharta. India has to become it has to stand on its own feet so that it can play a vital role, important role in the world. So in that direction, we want to take India forward. So that is why we are today talking about $5 trillion economy. $5 trillion economy means India will become the third largest economy in the world. We will be integrated into world economy. In that direction, the country should move forward. Let me conclude by saying that our vision for new India will have this Atmanirbhar Bharat will have 3 stages. Number 1, Atma Gaurav India, a country that has enormous self-respect, self-dignity, which we also call as, describe it as Swadeshi, etc. It's about having pride in having our own systems in place. Atma Gaurav. Second is Atma Samriddhi. You have to be self-sufficient. India should not depend on other countries for smaller things. I just give you one example. You all wear jean pants. We produce the textile for jean pants, but we don't produce the zippers for jean pants. Why is it so? So these are all very small things. But in all these areas, India has to be self-reliant. I'm not saying India should manufacture its own Tesla car in India. That probably will import. That technology you don't have. Fair enough. But that is the second aspect called Atma Samruddhi, self-sufficiency. But the third and most important is Atma Vishwas. a confidence to play a bigger role in the world. So Atma Gaurav, Atma Samruddhi, and Atma Vishwas wala Bharat, that is what Atma Nirbhar Bharat means. That is the kind of Bharat we have embarked on building in the next, say, a decade's time. That is the vision of this government and Honorable Prime Minister Modi ji.
Right, sir. All right, so on that note, then I want to thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. It was an amazing discussion and debate to have with you, and I'm sure once things get better, we'll love to have you in the university as well and give a talk live for the students. I thank you again and your entire office for coordinating this. And I wish you good health from all the students' side. And thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Dr. Ramad.
Great pleasure. I would love to come down to your campus sometime and meet with all of you in person.
Thank you so much, sir. So have a great day.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Namaskar.
So much.